Section 33 of the Modern Women's Rights Movement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Modern Women's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher, translated by Carl Conrad Eckhart. Bosnia and Herzegovina. Total population 1,591,036. The men preponderate numerically. Bosnia and Herzegovina, being Mohammedan countries, have harems and the restricted views of harem life. Naturally, a women's rights movement is not to be thought of. Polygamy and patriarchal life are characteristic. Into this Mohammedan country, the Austrian government has sent women disseminators of the culture of Western Europe, the Bosnian district women doctors. The first of these was Dr. Feodora Krajewska in Dolna Tuzla, now in Sarajevo. Now she has several women colleagues. The women doctors wear uniforms, a black coat, a black overcoat with crimson facings and with 2 stars on the collar. Persia. Total population about 9.5 million. In Persia, hardly a beginning of the women's rights movement exists. The report that I have before me closes this. The Persian woman lives, as it were, a negative life, but does not seem to strive for a change in her condition. Certainly not. Like the Turkish and the Arabian woman, she is bound by the Koran. Her educational opportunities are even less. There are very few European schools, governesses, and women doctors in Persia. Her field of activity is restricted to agriculture, domestic service, tailoring, and occasionally teaching. However, she is said to be quite skillful in the management of her financial affairs. As far as I know, the Persian woman took no part in the constitutional struggle of 1908 to 1909. End of section 33. Read by Mamacheetah, Tangerang Selatan.
Section 34 of the Modern Women's Rights Movement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Andy Glover. The Modern Women's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher. Translated by Carl Conrad Eckhart. India. Total population 300 million. The Indian women's rights movement originated through the efforts of the English. The movement is as necessary and as difficult as the movement in China. The Indian religions teach that woman should be despised. A cow is worth more than 1,000 women. The birth of a girl is a misfortune. May the tree grow in the forest, but may no daughter be born to me. Formerly, it was permissible to drown newborn girls. The English government had to abolish this barbarity, as it abolished the sooty. The Indian woman lives in her apartment, the zenana. Here the mother-in-law wields the scepter over the daughters-in-law, the grandchildren, and the women servants. The small girl learns to cook and to embroider. Anything beyond that is iniquitous. Woman has no brain. The girls that are educated in England must upon their return again don the veil and adjust themselves to native conditions. At the age of 5 or 6, the little girls are engaged, sometimes to young men of 10 or 12 years, sometimes to men of 40 or 50. The marriage takes place several years later. Sometimes a man has more than one wife. The wife waits on her husband while he is eating. She eats what remains. If the wife bears a son, she is reinstated. If she is widowed, she must fast and constantly offer apologies for existing. The widows and orphans were the first natives to become interested in the higher education of women. This was due to economic and social conditions. India was the cradle of mankind. Even the highest civilizations still bear indelible marks of the dreadful barbarities that have just been mentioned. The Indian woman has rebelled against her miserable condition. The English women considered it possible to bring health, hope, and legal aid to the women of the Zenana, through women doctors, women missionaries, and women lawyers. Hence, in 1866, Zenana missions were organized by English women doctors and missionaries. Native women were soon studying medicine in order to bring an end to the superstitions of the Zenana. Dr. Clara Swain came to India in 1869 as the first woman medical missionary. As early as 1872 to 1873, the first hospital for women was founded. In 1885, through the work of Lady Dufferin, there originated the Indian National League for giving medical aid to women. Nationalverband für Arschliche Frauenhilfe in Indien. Native women have studied law in order to represent their sex in the courts. Their chief motive was to secure an opportunity of conferring with the women in the Zenana, a privilege not granted the male lawyer. The first Indian woman lawyer, Cornelia Sorabija, was admitted to the bar in Pune. Even in England, the women have not yet been granted this privilege. This is easily explained. The Indian women cannot be clients of men lawyers. What men lawyers cannot take, they generously leave to the women lawyers. India has 300 million people. Hence, these meager beginnings of a woman's rights movement are infinitesimal when compared with the vast work that remains undone. Footnote: India still retains the official regulation of prostitution, which was abolished in England in 1886. Here again, militarism is playing a decisive part in blocking this reform. End footnote. The educated Indian woman is participating in the nationalist movement that is now being directed against English rule. Brahmanism hinders the Indian woman in making use of educational opportunities offered by the English government. Brahmanism and its priests nourish in woman a feeling of humility and the fear that she will lose her caste through contact with Europeans and infidels. The Parsi women and the Mohammedan women do not have this fear. The Parsi women, Pundita Ramabai for example, have played a leading part in the emancipation of their sex in India. But the Mohammedan women of India are reached by the movement only with difficulty. By the Hindu of the old regime, woman is kept in great ignorance and superstition. Her education is limited to a small stock of aphorisms and rules of etiquette. Her life in the Zenana is largely one of idleness. Ennui almost causes them to lose their minds, is a statement based on the reports of missionaries. There are modern schools for girls in all large cities, Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, etc. The status of the native woman has been Europeanized to the greatest extent in Bengal. The best educated of the native women of all classes are the dancing girls, bayaderes. Unfortunately, they are not virtuous women, unyet femmes. Hence, education among women has been in ill repute. A Congress of Women was held in Calcutta in 1906 with a woman as chairman. This Congress discussed the condition of Indian women. At the Medical Congress of 1909 in Bombay, Hindu women doctors spoke effectively. The women doctors have formed the Association of Medical Women in India. In Madras, there is published the Indian Ladies Magazine. Footnote: in Bangkok, in farther India, Siam, there is a women's club with the Siamese princess as president. End footnote. End of section 34.
Section 35 of the Modern Women's Rights Movement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Modern Women's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher, translated by Carl Conrad Eckhart. China. Total population 426 million. The Chinese woman of the lower classes has the same status as the Mohammedan woman, ostensible freedom of movement and hard work. The women of the property-owning classes, however, must remain in the house. Here, entertaining one another, they live and eat apart from the men. As woman is not considered in the Chinese worship of ancestors, her birth is as unwished for as that of the Indian woman. Among the poor, the birth of a daughter is an economic misfortune. Who will provide for her? Hence, in the 3 most densely populated provinces, the murder of girl babies is quite common. In many cases, mothers kill their little girls to deliver them from the misery of later life. The father, husband, and the mother-in-law are the masters of the Chinese woman. She can possess property only when she is a widow. See the much more liberal provisions of the Koran. The earnings of the Chinese wife belong to her husband, but in case of a dispute in this matter, no court would decide in the husband's favor, for he is supposed to be the breadwinner of the family. Polygamy is customary, but the Chinese may have only one legitimate wife, while the Mohammedan may have 4. The concubine has the status of a hetera. She travels with the man, keeps his accounts, etc. The Chinese woman of the property-owning class lives, in contrast to the Hindu woman, a life filled with domestic duties. She makes all the clothes for the family. Even the most wealthy women embroider. Frequently, the wife succeeds in becoming the adviser of the husband. A widow is not despised. She can remarry. The women of the lower classes engage in agriculture, domestic service, the retail business, all kinds of agencies and commission businesses, factory work to a small extent, medical science, practiced in a purely experimental way, and midwifery. They carry burdens and assist in the loading and unloading of ships. Women's wages are 1/2 or 3/4 of those of the men. The lives of the Chinese women, especially among the lower classes, are so wretched that mothers believe they are doing a good deed when they strangle their little girls or place them on the doorstep where they will be gathered up by the wagon that collects the corpses of children. Many married women commit suicide. The suffering of the women in this dark land is indescribable, says an American woman missionary. Those Chinese women that believe in the transmigration of souls hope in the next world to be anything but a woman. Foreign women doctors, like the women missionaries, are bringing a little cheer into these sad places. Most of these women are English or American. The beginning of a real women's rights movement is the work of the anti-foot binding societies, which are opposing the binding of women's feet. This reform is securing supporters among men and women. For 17 years, there has existed a school for Chinese women. This was founded by Kang Yu-Lee, the first Chinese to demand that both sexes should have the same rights. The women that have devoted themselves during these 17 years to the emancipation of their sex must often face martyrdom. Sin King, the founder of a semi-monthly magazine for women and of a modern school for girls, met death on the scaffold in 1907 during a political persecution directed against all progressive elements. Another women's rights advocate, Miss Sin Pengsi, donated 200,000 taels. The tael is equivalent to 72.9 cents for the erection of a gymnasium for girls in her native city, 100,000 taels to endow a pedagogical magazine, and 50,000 taels for the support of minor schools for girls. Still another women's rights advocate, Wu Fanglan, resisted every attempt to bind her feet in the traditional manner. There exists a women's league through whose efforts the government in 1908 prohibited the binding of the feet of little girls. In recent years, the women's magazines have increased in number. 4 large publications devoted solely to women's interests are published in Canton. 5 are published in Shanghai, and about as many in every other large city. The new system of education, adopted in 1905, grants women freedom. Girls' schools have been opened everywhere. In the large cities, there are girls' secondary schools in which the Chinese classics, foreign languages, and other cultural subjects are taught. In Tianjin, there is a seminary for women teachers. Si Tu Fa, a prominent Chinese administrative official who is also a governor and a lawyer, recently delivered a lecture in Paris on the status of the Chinese woman. This lecture contradicts the statements made above. Among other things, he declared that China has produced too many distinguished women in the political as well as in other fields for law and public opinion to restrict the freedom of women. The Chinese admits superiority with all its consequences as soon as he sees it, and this, whether it is shown by man or woman. Footnote: Les Chinois admettent la supériorité avec toute son conséquence, dès qu'ils le constatent, qu'elle s'est révélée chez un homme ou chez une femme. End of footnote. According to him, there can be no women's rights movement in China because man does not oppress woman. He declares that the progress of women in China since 1905 is a manifestation of patriotism, not of feminism. According to our experiences, the opinions of Si Tu Fa are attributable to a peculiarly masculine way of observing things. End of section 35.
Section 36 of The Modern Women's Rights Movement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in January 2022. The Modern Women's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher, translated by Karl Konrad Eckhardt. Japan and Korea. Total population 46,732,876. Women 23,131,236. Men 23,601,640. Previous to the 13th century, the Japanese woman, when compared with the other women of the Far East, occupied a specially favored position as wife and mother, as scholar, author, and counselor in business and political affairs. All these rights were lost during the civil wars waged in the period between the 13th and 17th centuries. War and militarism are the sworn enemies of women's rights. A further cause of the Japanese woman's loss of rights was the strong influence of Chinese civilization, embodied in the teachings of Confucius. The Japanese woman was expected to be obedient. Her virtues became passive and negative. In the seaports and chief cities, European influence has during the last 50 years caused changes in the dress, general bearing, and social customs of the Japanese. During the past 30 years, these changes have been furthered by the government. While Japan was rising to the rank of a great world power, she was also providing an excellent educational system for women. The movement began with the erection of girls' schools. The Empress is the patroness of an Imperial Educational Society, a secondary school for girls, and Educational Institute for the Daughters of Nobles, and of a seminary for women teachers. All of these institutions are in Tokyo. Women formed in 1898 13% of the total number of teachers. Japanese women of wealth and women of the nobility support these educational efforts. They also support the Charity Bazaar Society, the Orphans' Home, and the Red Cross Society. The Red Cross Society trained an excellent corps of nurses, as the Russo-Japanese War demonstrated. Women are employed as government officials in the railroad offices. They are also employed in banks. Japanese women study medicine, pharmacy, and midwifery in special institutions, which have hundreds of women enrolled. Many women attend commercial and technical schools. Women are engaged in industry, at very low wages to be sure, but this fact enables Japan to compete successfully for markets. The number of women in industry exceeds that of the men. In 1900, there were 181,692 women and 100,962 men industrially engaged. In the textile industry, 95% of the laborers are women. Women also outnumber the men in home industries. Women's average daily wages are 12.5 cents. Women remain active in commerce and industry, for the workers are recruited from the lower classes, and they have been better able to withstand Chinese influence. Chinese law, based on the teachings of Confucius, still prevails with all its harshness for the Japanese woman. The tax-paying Japanese becomes a voter at the age of 25. The Japanese woman has no political rights. Hence, a petition has been presented to the parliament requesting that women be granted the right to form organizations and to hold meetings. Parliament favored the measure, but the government is still hesitating, hence a new petition has been sent to Parliament. The modern women's rights movement in Japan is supported by the following organizations: two societies favoring women's education, the Associations for Hygiene, and the Society favoring dress reform. The Women's Union and the League of Women can be regarded as political organizations. There are Japanese women authors and journalists. Since Korea has belonged to Japan, changes have begun there also. The Korean women have neither a first name nor a family name. According to circumstances, they are called daughter of A.B., wife of A, etc. It is a sign of the time and also of the awakening of woman's self-reliance that the government of Korea has been presented with a petition, signed by many women, requesting that these conditions be abolished and that women be granted the right to have their own names. End of section 36.
Section 37 of the Modern Woman's Rights Movement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. The Modern Woman's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher. Translated by Carl Conrad Eckhart. We have completed our journey round the world. From Japan to the United States is only a short distance, and the intellectual relations between the two countries are quite intimate. Few Oriental people seem more susceptible to European culture than the Japanese. But whatever women's rights movement there is in non-European countries, it owes its origin almost without exception to the activity of educated Occidentals, to the men and women teachers, educators, doctors, and missionaries. Here is an excellent field for our activities. Here is a duty that we dare not forget in the midst of our own struggles, for we cannot estimate the noble work and uplifting power that the world loses in those countries where women are merely playthings and beasts of burden. Conclusion. In the greater part of the world, woman is a slave and a beast of burden. In these countries, she rules only in exceptional cases, and then through cunning. Equality of rights is not recognized. Neither is the right of woman to act on her own responsibility. Even in most countries of European civilization, woman is not free or of age. In these countries, too, she exists merely as a sexual being. Woman is free and is regarded as a human being only in a very small part of the civilized world. Even in these places, we see daily tenacious survivals of the old barbarity and tyranny. Hence, it is not true that woman is the weaker, the protected, the loved, and the revered sex. In most cases, she is the overworked, exploited, and, even when living in luxury, the oppressed sex. These circumstances dwarf woman's humanity and limit the development of her individuality, her freedom, and her responsibility. These conditions are opposed by the women's rights movement. The movement hopes to secure the happiness of woman, of man, of the child, and of the world by establishing the equal rights of the sexes. These rights are based on the recognition of equality of merit. They provide for responsibility of action. Most men do not understand this ideal. They oppose it with unconscious egotism. This book has given an accurate account of the means by which men oppose woman's rights: scoffing, ridicule, insinuation, and finally, when prejudice, stubbornness, and selfishness can no longer resist the force of truth, the argument that they do not wish to grant us our rights. There is little encouragement in this, but it shall not perplex us. Man, by opposing woman, caused the struggle between the sexes. Only equality of rights can bring peace. Woman is already certain of her equality. Man will learn by experience that renunciation can be manly, that business can be feminine, and that all privilege is obnoxious. The emancipation of woman is synonymous with the education of man. Educating is always a slow process, but it inspires limitless hope. When ideas have once seized the masses, these ideas become an irresistible force. This is irrefutably proved by the strong growth of our movement since 1904 in all countries of European civilization, and by the awakening of women even in the depths of Oriental civilization. The events of the past 5 years justify us in entertaining great hopes. End of section 37. End of The Modern Woman's Rights Movement by Käthe Schirmacher, translated by Carl Conrad Eckhart.